Okay, so here is your 4.6 warm-up. So take out a blank piece, or take out your warm-ups. And you don't have to copy this whole proof part here, but you do need to copy the picture, mark the given information, mark anything else that you can mark like we normally do, and then just number 1, 2, 3, 4 and fill in what the blank should be. So go ahead and pause this while you do that. Okay, so now let's go through this problem. So angle 1 congruent to angle 2. And S is the midpoint of segment JK. So remember, if S is the midpoint, it means that JS and SK are congruent to each other. That's what the definition of midpoint says. It says if it's a midpoint, then it bisects the angle into two congruent angles, or bisects the segment into two congruent segments. And then if you think about it, what else could we mark like we were doing our problems previously? I could mark this because of reflexive. And so now we're just going to fill it in. So number 1 is given. Number 2 should be segment JS is congruent to segment KS. And the reason we marked that because it was the midpoint. So it's definition of midpoint. And remember I said if you see words in the given, you're going to use definition of those words. Now they're giving us the reason this time, so they're saying that's reflexive, and so we marked segment RS congruent to itself because they share that side. So segment RS is congruent to segment RS, and if you put segment SR is congruent to segment SR, that's okay too. And then now we're proving that the triangles are congruent, so we look at this and this is SAS is the reason that they're congruent. Okay. Now go ahead and take out your worksheet if you haven't already, or your packet with your proofs in it, and I'm going to go over a few of them that I think maybe were the hardest and that students have struggled before. If I didn't hit yours, that's okay, because remember the answer key is posted on Brightspace, so you can always check that. So go ahead and pause this while you get that out. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is number 3. And so I'm going to mark my given information. So ZW is parallel to YX, so we put the arrows. And segment ZW is also congruent to XY, so I also put the slashes on it. And we're trying to prove that the triangles are congruent. So remember that the reason here is going to be one of those 5 shortcuts that we had talked about. And so first one we'll have given. Now this one, I think on yours it says if parallel lines cut by transversal, then AIA are congruent. That's, remember, the alternate interior angles theorem. And so that one was when you had the Z. So if you look on here, the Z that we can use is this one because of the parallels. And so which angles can we say are congruent to each other? The armpit angles, angles 3 and 4. So I'm going to say angle 3 is congruent to angle 4, and then I'm also going to mark that because now we need to mark the rest of what we need to do so that we can decide if it's SSS, SAS, ASA, AAS, or HL. Now this one says that segment ZX is congruent to segment XZ. So we'll mark that with doubles, and that's reflexive property. And even though they changed the order here, ZX to XZ, remember that's the same exact segment. So ZX is the same as segment XZ, and so that was reflexive property. And now if you look at this, this is SAS is your reason that they're congruent. Okay. So I would probably do, I haven't decided if I'll do 1 point per blank or a half point per blank, but marking your picture with all the stuff that you need to mark it for to decide if it's congruent or not, that's worth 1 whole point. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is number 4. And so on number 4, let's go ahead and mark P is congruent to S, and O is the midpoint of segment PS, so then that means I'm going to mark PO and OS congruent to each other. I don't know that O is the midpoint of QR, so I cannot mark that. I just know that O is the midpoint from P to S, and so that's given. Segment PO is congruent to segment OS. Remember, we marked that because of midpoint. So that's definition of midpoint. And then they're telling us angle ROS is congruent to angle QOP. And what's that reason? What are those? Those are vertical angles. So then your reason is going to be vertical angles theorem. It's not definition of vertical angles. Definition of vertical angles just says what they are. Like when you have that two intersecting lines, they're across from each other. Vertical angles theorem says if you have vertical angles, then they're congruent. So that's why we can say these are congruent. And then by my picture, whoops, I should have put doubles here. Hopefully you were screaming at me on that one. You have to put doubles because we already used singles, and then those are congruent because you have two angles and the side touching both of those angles. So then that's angle, side, angle. Okay. All right. The next one I want to talk about is number 7. And so I'm going to mark M as the midpoint of segment AB. So M is the midpoint of AB. So I'll put slashes on both sides of M there. AC is congruent to MD, so put doubles there, and AC is also parallel to MD. Okay, so then that's given information. Now they're giving us the reason this time was definition of midpoint, and so we go back to our picture, and what we marked because we saw midpoint was these two slashes. So then that means that segment AM is congruent to segment BM. And I'm going in that order because I need to match it up. So A to M and B to M. Then it's saying angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. So let me mark that. And then we have to figure out the reason. Well, do you see an F on its back right here? Don't worry, that's not for you. I'm recording during my plan period here. So we've got an F, and we know the armpit angles are congruent. Now, what were those armpit angles called? We know that the Z angles were alternate interior angles. What were these F angles? Those were corresponding angles. And so then my reason for angle 1 being congruent to angle 4 is corresponding angles postulate. Then these triangles are congruent because we have side, angle, side. We have the angle where the two sides meet. So that's SAS. Okay. All right. The next one I want to talk about is number 10. And so this was the second half of notes that we took yesterday, where now we're going a step past saying that they're congruent. And so let me mark my picture. PQ is congruent to PS, QR is congruent to SR, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Okay, so all of that is given. So then they're saying segment PR is congruent to segment PR, so we can mark that in our picture. And so that is reflexive property. And the triangles are congruent. You actually have a couple of choices here. You could either use side, side, side because you have 3 pairs of sides, or side, angle, side also works here because we've got this angle. You don't have to put both, you can just put one, but either one would work as your reason. Then when we go one step further, now that I know these are congruent, then I could mark everything else congruent. So angle 3 corresponds to angle 4. So I could mark those, and the reason is CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So once you know you've got congruent triangles, then everything else that's not marked, all the other corresponding parts, will be congruent to each other because of this. And that's it. All right, and then the last one I want to go over was your very last one where you had to completely fill everything in. Now I want to note on this one that it's a little confusing because you've got these two triangles, you've got these two smaller triangles, you got the bigger triangle here. So make sure that you're looking at the prove. Which triangles are you trying to prove are congruent? and we're trying to prove that LKM, so LKM, so this triangle right here, is congruent to triangle LKN, this triangle right here. So make sure that when you're trying to prove this, you don't even need this information down there. I'm just going to change my color of my pen here. But we don't need this information. Okay, so just keep that in mind when we're trying to write this out. So segment LM is congruent to LN, so I'm going to put slashes there. Segment KM is congruent to segment KN, so I'm going to put doubles there. And so when you're looking at these two red triangles, we don't care about the rest, then I can also mark that LK is congruent to itself for reflexive. And so then hopefully you can see that these two red triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So now we just need to put that in a proof. Well, we always start with our given. And that's given. We always put what we're trying to prove as the last statement. So LKM is congruent to triangle LKN. Okay, so those are already filled out. And then remember, the thing that we marked as our middle step here is we marked reflexive. So I know this is going to be reflexive property. And so my statement will be that segment LK is congruent to segment LK. And then my reason for these being congruent, we said, was side, side, side. So if you do all the picture stuff first and then put it in a proof, it's not so bad. Okay? So that concludes this. Again, if you want to see the rest of them, you can check out the Brightspace with the answer key for that.